You're listening to Lemon's Listening Library. Discover the story behind the stories with unique and raw conversations from the people who make your favorite books a reality. Welcome to this episode of Lemon's Listening Library. I'm your host, Randy Lemons, fantasy author, or RL Rose to those of you in the romance community. Today, I have a very intriguing and interesting guest that I actually am so excited to introduce to you guys. But first, a little housekeeping because I know the suspense kills everybody. So, if you guys would like to, head over to our Patreon account and check out our features that we have there. We really are asking that our listeners go over to our YouTube account, comment on each episode, review us there, review us on your chosen platform that you listen to podcasts, so Spotify, Apple, all of the good stuff. It's the easiest way to support our show, and it helps. It's so impactful if you guys do that. So we also have advertising spots available. So if you guys are interested in purchasing those, email us at lemonslisteninglibrary@gmail.com and we will get you all the information for that. So the moment you guys have been waiting for, it's so exciting. This guest I am so excited to talk about because he's got some knowledge. I feel like this should be like a knowledge podcast that we're about to drop on you guys. But Mark David Gerson, please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Hi, thank you, Randy. Well, you've already got my name. I'm the author of more than 20 books, fantasy series, I guess I'd call it a general or literary fiction series, a bunch of books on writing and creativity, some memoirs, some personal growth, spiritual inspirational titles, a whole bunch of stuff. I'm also, and this happened since we booked this, so this is new for you too, Randy.
Oh, exciting!
I took all because I teach writing, I coach writers, I do all kinds of things to help people tell their stories, and so I grouped all those offerings together in what I'm calling the Mark David Gerson School of Writing, and that's just launching right about now, and you'll actually see that page on my website.
That's so cool. I was looking at, and I know you probably haven't updated since last year, but I was looking at all your classes and all your workshops, and it's like sold out, sold out, sold out. And I'm like, dang, get it, Mark David.
Well, the good news is that if you go to the courses page on the website, you will see a whole bunch of pre-recorded courses that you can just download.
I did. I saw that. And
So
they're cheap too. I mean, not saying that what you're providing is cheap, but like it's affordable. I think 33, 44, like I think
and
the
something
lowest I saw
like
was
that, yeah.
20 something. Yeah, it was fantastic.
So be aware that as the school unfolds, some of those prices might change. So I can't promise they're going to stay the same. I also can't guarantee they're going to go up. But if you want to take advantage of those, we'll call them reasonable, affordable prices, then now's a good time to go and check them out.
Yes, yes. And like if you're listening to this podcast and you want to get that, because you heard him now, he's opening up this huge other thing. Go buy him now before the prices go up, because as he adds content, I imagine it's going to go up. So
Right.
that's really cool. I love that you're kind of giving back to the community of like, I've got all this knowledge, I've accumulated all these trial and error moments, and here is the roadmap to not necessarily do what I've done. We
Pretty
appreciate
much.
your work.
Thank you.
One of the first things I want to talk about, because I find this very interesting, and all authors, everyone in the creative world has a muse, right? We all have our thing that inspires us. We all have our thing that's like, that's why we started writing this story. You said that you were tricked into writing by your muse. Can you share that story? Because that sounds interesting.
Sure. So I spent all my school years um, running away from anything creative. I didn't like English class. I gravitated toward maths. Um, um, and I did that I mean, I didn't realize it at the time, but I think I was terrified of being judged. And the great thing about math was there was one right answer. And if you got the right answer, then you were safe. English class with interpretations and all these gray areas just made me very queasy. And then one day, I was in my junior year of high school, and they were putting on a musical, the musical Mame, great show, and I was asked to help with publicity. And without thinking, which is probably a good thing. I said yes and discovered I had to start writing press releases, something I'd never done before. So I learned how to write press releases, and kind of sort of began to write a little bit. I mean, it's formulaic, but it's still writing and it's putting it out there. The following year, another musical, and that was Hello Dolly, and I was asked to head the publicity committee group, whatever it was called. So I had to do more of that stuff. And I did such a good job that as I graduated and went to college, I began doing more theater publicity. And of course, I had to write. Um, and we'll just kind of fast forward a bit. I graduated from college. My first job was with an entertainment PR company, which happened because of all that theater publicity. And I had to write even more. And and then my next job was with Concordia University, which is one of Canada's largest universities. I'm originally from Montreal. That's Montreal. And I had to write articles and do interviews. And suddenly I was writing what I'd never written before, and being paid for it. And suddenly I was a writer. Now we have to backtrack a bit because rewind the tape to before those college music or those high school musicals. Um, Now you have to realize that even though I look really, really young, I was around before there were computers, or at least portable computers. And like probably when I was in my freshman or sophomore year of high school, I was gifted a typewriter because that's what we used back then, right? Now it wasn't a Smith Corona, it wasn't a Royal, it wasn't an Underwood. All the kind of name brands we know, in Canada as well as in the US, it was a little known Swiss brand called Hermes. Now, Hermes, if you know your Greek mythology, is the counterpart of Mercury, if you know your Roman
Astrology.
mythology.
Yeah.
And he was the messenger god, the god of communication.
Oh my gosh, that's so
So
cool.
so long before even those musicals, somebody gave me a Hermes typewriter. So
Oh,
apparently
wow.
the die was already cast, and I
Yep.
didn't know
You
it.
had
Right?
no choice.
I had no choice. So it was kind of in the cards, if you will, and apparently you can run but you can't hide. And my muse finally caught up with me, and that's kind of how, little by little, I was tricked into it until there was no turning back.
Yeah, I love that you use the word tricked because like you're pushing it away, you don't want it, but then you find this talent. And I don't think people realize the amount of creativity that goes into publicity stuff, like marketing and getting people to pay attention to something. You have to be fast, you have to catch their attention, you have to connect with them in a very short amount of time.
Yes, and in fact, the job I had at Concordia was in the public relations office, and when I finally left to freelance full time as a writer and editor, who knew, or who could have predicted? I was the assistant director of PR, so I have a strong PR background, but that does go back a year or two.
So I'm picturing. I love how you said somebody gave you this typewriter, but I'm picturing in my head because I'm a fantasy writer. I'm like that someone no one gave it to you. It just appeared in your
It
office.
just
Like
appeared right.
it was just there. That was the hidden item that you got for your quest.
Well, it was probably, I'm guessing, because I don't remember, I'm guessing it was my mother, but why that, again, why that typewriter? In
And
fact,
that
I
brand.
found, and that brand, I mean, I found a picture, I mean, I remember it was a portable, it was green, and I found a picture online of what I think it was. And I've
Yeah.
used it, I've written a memoir, and I told this and other stories around my reluctant career as a writer. Um, and I've used that typewriter to illustrate it because it was just kind of fun to find that again.
Yeah. I have a question for you. Have you ever dove into kind of what your fear was around getting the judgment?
Yeah, so I'm going to fast forward and tell you a different story, which kind of speaks to that. So I was freelancing. I'd moved to Toronto. I was freelancing as a writer and as an editor. I was doing magazine work. I was doing corporate work. I was doing government work, and I had a gig as an in-house edit, freelance editor at a lifestyles magazine in Toronto. And one Monday morning, I came in, and the associate editor comes up to me, and she's gushing, and this woman never gushed, and this woman never pushed, and said, "I took this creative writing workshop this weekend. You have to take it." And I kind of went like that and backed away slowly
You
because
hated writing. Wow.
Be, well, because it was now it was I mean I was writing, but now it was creative writing. Now we're going deeper, and until then I had been telling I've been writing magazine articles. I've been writing other people's stories to other people's deadlines. It really wasn't touching what was in here, right?
Yeah.
And so, but Karen, who was so soft spoken and so not pushy, I mean even her voice was soft. She kept at me all day. And finally, probably for the same reason, the same unconscious reason I said yes to doing publicity for MAME back in the day, I said, okay. And I signed up. But so the reason I kept saying no was, to answer your question, was this was my kind of um, fantasy, the nightmare fantasy vision of a creative writing class. Everybody sits and writes, and then one by one, people get up and read their writing, and everyone takes out their machine guns and guns them down. So
Your
the
mind was
writer law.
already ready to write these stories with your
so,
imagination of
so
like what can go wrong.
so one writer's lying in a pool of blood, the next writer stands up. Same thing happens. Same thing happens. Same thing happens until it's mass carnage. So
And then the
that's
person
what
who
that
put on the show goes and picks up all their paperwork and writes it for themselves, and that's how.
whatever. I never got that far because I was dead, right? So I wouldn't have known. But I mean, that's how intense my fear of being judged was, and having
Oh
my work kind
man.
of ripped to shreds, basically in my face. Um, but I went to that creative writing workshop, and it was the beginning. Things didn't change that day, but it was the beginning of a massive shift in everything in my life, including my creativity, my spirituality, everything. Everything began to change that day.
Yeah. I like the analogy of like you make a little shift. I think it's like airplanes or something like that, but you change your dial just a little bit and you're going to end up in such different locations by just making that tiny shift. And it seems you can't measure it in the moment, but you
Of
can in
course
the
not.
end in the results.
Right. Well, and um, we never really see the impact of our decisions
Yeah.
until down the road. And if I had known that day when this young woman, well, I was a young man, when this woman was going after me to take this workshop, I probably would have I probably would have gone this and not backed away slowly, but run screaming from the building, because my life is so different now, and I mean, over the past 30 years than it was in that moment
Do you think
back
if
in
you
that.
had, in that moment, if you had gotten a glimpse into what your life is now, you think you still really would have ran from it? Like if you saw, I guess it
Who
probably would
I
have been
was
scary because it was so
who I
different.
was then probably would have run. I mean, I'm not saying I could have run successfully, but I might not have said yes that day.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh
I
man.
suspect I suspect that my muse, again in retrospect, you see how insistent and pushy and tricksterish it was and still is in some ways. Um, I'm sure I would have gotten roped in another way, but that was the way that I began to surrender, I should say.
Yeah. So growing up, you didn't have any other creative outlets as a kid? Like did you play
I read.
imagination play?
I had an. I, apparently, I don't remember this, but my mother and sister told me I had two imaginary friends. I remember nothing about them, so I don't know how old I was. I read voraciously. I mean, my mother was a huge reader, and took me to the library with her, and I never stopped reading, and I think
Yeah.
that really has informed everything, because I think I say this in one of my books for writers. We learn so much by osmosis. I mean, I can't even begin to say how much I learned about writing simply by reading a lot.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I did not draw, but I did play music. I played the alto sax in the school band. So that, I mean, I wasn't I wasn't composing certainly, but that was creative. But again, I just shied away from. And I was in the show. I was in both shows. I was in the chorus of Mame. God knows why I even how I could have agreed to do that. And
So
then,
did you feel like you were a good singer, or was it just something that you're like,
well,
every
when you're
there's
in the
enough people
chorus,
around me that
exactly, that's it. That's it. When there's less people around you, it doesn't matter, right?
yeah,
They were looking for bodies more than voices, I think.
you
And
you
the
could not
next
even
year,
been singing, just kind of moving your mouth, and they wouldn't have
right,
known.
right. The next year, I was in the chorus, and I think I had one line because in the big scene where Dolly comes into the restaurant down the stairs, I was one of the cooks, and I think I had to say something. I don't remember now, but I had to say something.
Moving along.
Right. So that was my big stage debut, um, as a cook in Hello Dolly.
That's so interesting. I especially with your personality talking to you now, I just can't picture you as someone to shy away from things. You seem so, and obviously, that goes back to the trajectory thing. Like this person
Right.
ends up as this person and it looks way different.
Well, I was very shy, and maybe for the same reasons, I didn't want to do the creative writing workshop. I didn't want to be seen and judged. In fact,
Yeah.
when I was very little, we had a console TV in a cabinet in the corner of the living room, and one of my favorite places to hang out was behind it.
Oh gosh,
So,
bad time to take a drink.
oh, sorry. So,
No, you're
so,
fine.
hiding was something I did, and
Yeah.
the creative writing workshop, that one day workshop,
So
kind of
you know how
nudged
there's
me out of
there's the
hiding.
word for sensory seekers. You were a sensory avoider. You were
Yes.
like, I don't want this. I want the you wanted this
Uh,
space the little quiet ball with no lights
right.
and no wow, that's
So
cool.
there's a picture again. I don't remember this. There's a photo of me. I don't know, 4 or 5 or 6. I would say 4 or 5 maybe. Um, and somebody, can't have been me at that age, had taken cardboard cartons and built some kind of a fort or playhouse or something in the far corner of the backyard. There's a picture of me standing in front of it. I can only imagine that must have been my favorite place to be outside if the behind the TV was my favorite place to be inside.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So outside you made a fort that you could hide in, and inside you had one as well.
Right. Well, I don't know if I made the one outside, but I certainly took advantage of it. Again, according to that photo.
Right.
And
That's
there's
so cute.
another photo of me, which I think was my first day of school. And there's me standing with my shorts and my white shirt and my little bow tie, probably. I don't know if this was This must have been kindergarten, I guess, because must have been the first day
Oh,
of school. And I look terrified. I
but you
look
look
like
like
the
a little
worst.
terrified professor, I imagine.
Probably. I look like the world is about to come to an end.
Oh my gosh. That is so adorable, but like heartbreaking at the same time. Did you have siblings, or was there anything that kind of like initiated this fear of like, if I live too much, something bad will happen?
No, I had an older sister. She's since passed, and she was a bit of a bully, but I don't think that was it. There is a story that I actually share in my Acts of Surrender memoir, and I actually fictionalize in one of my nonfiction, my non sorry, in my non-fantasy fiction series, which is kind of too long to go into here. But the bottom line of the story is that I discovered after my mother died that the man I thought was my father was not my father.
Oh,
So,
wow.
now it's a whole story there, which I could go into, but I don't want to use up the entire time or talk to go into that.
Right.
But I can only imagine um, that my mother must have been terrified while she was pregnant, that the little guy or girl, probably didn't, I'm sure they didn't do ultrasound back then, who was going to pop out was going to look like the wrong person.
Mm,
And so one could say that I kind of took in some of that fear of being out in the world and not being seen, or being seen for who I shouldn't be.
yeah.
My
That is an interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people consider is the emotions that we pass to our children in the womb. I'm adopted. I was adopted under a year old, and my parents never made me feel like I was out of place. They never made me feel, anything. But I always had this sense of like something was off, something was not quite right. And my biological mom, she was not a super healthy person. She was on drugs, she was on all these things, and she was just afraid of the world. And I feel like a lot of some of my trauma that I can't explain comes from stuff I don't remember.
Sure. Well, and you have no way of remembering, in fact.
No, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
That's so cool. I love that you have pinpointed, so you're, like, working through your life, "Okay, it's not that, not that," and then when you get to the point to where it can't be anything that you can remember, let's go into in utero, let's go into the emotions that mom was passing down. That's a huge
Right,
skill.
right. And so I took that story. So my nonfiction series, sorry, my non-fantasy fiction series is called the Sarah Stories, and the first story in that series is called Sarah's Year, and I actually took some of that story and fictionalized it.
Yeah.
Um, so that the young man who is one of the main characters, obviously not Sarah, but the one young man who is one of the main characters, his mother did something similar. So the woman, the his mother is a fictionalized version of my mother as well in that story. I mean, it really is all fictionalized, and the father figure situation is very different from mine. So I know how all that happened now.
I
I would
have
say,
so
but
many questions for you. Like, that just opened up, like, so many questions. Okay. Um, I wanna start with, like, the obvious, which, we have a lot of authors who listen to this, and being able to take your story, being able to take a situation that really happened to you and fictionalize it and make it into a fantasy, but the underlying, like, these themes happened, everyone wonders if they can write a story, and there it is. Like, you something so mundane can happen to you, or something so serious where you feel like you knew this person your whole life, and then at the end of her life you find out this life altering thing. That's a huge story. Of course
it
you're
is,
going to write a fictionalized story about that.
well, the interesting thing is, before I took that creative writing workshop, the infamous, notorious creative writing workshop, and there were no machine guns, just to be clear. Um, it was Canada. There were no machine guns in creative writing
Yeah.
workshops. Um, I had after, and of course, I learned this after my mother died, after everyone had died except my mother's oldest friend, and she's the one who told me the story after my mother died, a few months after. And I thought, what a great story! I'm going to try to write about it, and it never went anywhere because I hadn't opened myself up or allowed myself to be opened up in the ways that workshop began to.
Yeah.
And it ended up being kind of almost like an encyclopedia entry. This happened and this happened and this happened. And there was no emotion to it at all.
Right.
Um, and when I began Sarah's Year, and this is interesting, in terms of how I write and how I teach writing, I had a premise. I don't often have a premise, but I had a premise. And the premise was that um, Sarah, who would have been in her early 60s at the time, is it opens up at Esther's funeral. Sarah and Esther have been best friends since elementary school, um, and of course, this is set in the 90s, so elementary school for them would have been in the 30s.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
um, and Sarah had a dream as a teenager of becoming an author, and Esther had a dream of becoming an artist, visual artist. And of course, given the times, given the war, given the
Yeah.
culture, none of that ever happened. And so Sarah is at her best friend's funeral. And the concept of the book, which it didn't play out the way I thought it was going to play out, the concept of the book is that this next year would be Sarah rediscovering that dream. And that's where the title Sarah's Year came from.
Oh.
But I always say when I'm teaching writing and when I'm writing is that my stories are smarter than I am.
Isn't that funny how that
And
works out?
my stories know themselves better than I could ever consciously imagine. So I'm actually sitting in a Starbucks in Santa Monica writing the first scene of this story idea, and it's at the cemetery and Esther's being buried and all this stuff, and something happens. Suddenly there's another character, Mr.'s son, who I had no
Oh my
plans.
gosh.
I had no plans for there to be an S, and there he is. All of a sudden, there he is. And
Yeah.
by the end of that writing session at the Starbucks, the story had changed completely.
That little trajectory change.
That's right. But so here's the key, because so for the next however many months it took me to write that first draft, um, I kept saying, "Well, that's very cool, but the title doesn't work anymore because it's not a year in Sarah's life."
Mhm.
In fact, leaving the flashbacks aside, the whole story takes place in 36 hours,
Oh
hardly a
wow.
year, right?
Yeah.
So, but my story is smarter than I am, and every time I would kind of go within and check in, and I got, no, the title is correct. The title, just don't mess with the title. It wasn't until one of the final scenes of that first draft that I realized why it was called that. And
Gosh.
it wasn't called that because it was a year in Sarah's life. And
Oh
so
my
this is
gosh.
so, when I teach, I don't outline when I write. I've never outlined anything. In fact, in high school, and I don't know what it's like now. When I was in high school, way back in the last century, when I was in high school, we had to hand in outlines with our essays.
That's probably what killed
Well,
your creativity a lot of the
well,
times.
it may have been one of the things that killed my creativity. Well, except that I was a rebel even then, though I didn't see myself as a rebel because I could not do that. I would write the essay and then I would craft the outline.
So you work ahead because you know they're gonna ask for the essay at the end, so you are already getting that out of the way. Because 'cause I'm sure they probably start off, "Okay, start with the outline," but you
Right,
start off with the essay, so
right,
you're
right.
already doing the
And I
work
would
for
not have
yourself.
bothered with the outline had it not been required, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I never outline my books. I never outline anything. I just start and let the story go where it goes. And and I've discovered after 7 novels, in terms of the fiction at least, the story really is smarter than I am, because the stories go in ways that my conscious mind could never have come up with.
Yeah.
In fact, I had a similar. So the Sarah's Year turned into a three book series, and there may be a fourth book, but right now it's only three. And I had the same title issue with the third book. I thought I have a great idea for a third book in this series. I'm going to call it the Emmeline Papers. I won't go to the reason why right now, but there was a reason for that. And I sat down. I was teaching a creative writing class in Santa Fe. And I sat down while they were writing and wrote a first scene based on the concept that I had come up with. And when I got home, I ripped it up because it felt all wrong. I began again, and the Emmeline Papers remains the perfect title for that story, but it has nothing at all to do with what I thought the story was going to be.
Oh my gosh, that is so, so cool. I was talking to another author and we were talking about the concept of like these stories that come to us are like potentially alternate realities or alternate things that need to be told in our reality or it was just like they feel so we don't have control over them. Like I don't know how to explain that as an author
That's a
other
perfect
than
way. That's
we
a
don't
perfect way.
have
We
control.
have no control. In fact, when I teach writing, I'm always telling people, stop trying to control the story, stop trying to control the characters, and let it unfold. Because again, so my first novel, which also began in a creative writing class I was teaching, is the first book in what became a fantasy series, The Moon Quest. I had never written a novel before. I had never written a book before. I had never written even a short story before, except in school maybe. Um, and I was teaching a group of, not all my classes and workshops are all women, but often they're mostly women. In this case, it was all women. And I led them through an exercise. I often use guided visualizations or meditations into writing. So I led them into the exercise, and a little voice, the voice, I guess, of my muse said while they were writing, "Okay, now you do the exercise and you write." Now, I'd never done that before because I always wanted to be kind of present in case anybody needed me or anything, or I was noticing somebody hesitating. But I'd worked with these women for 10 weeks already, I guess. And I thought, well, they're good. So I began to write. And what came out of me that evening became the first scene of the first draft of a novel I knew absolutely nothing about.
Oh
No
wow.
title, no concept, no clue. And as I continued working the next morning, I thought, well, let's just see where this is going. Um, I kept working on it, and the story would go off. Remember, it's fantasy; it doesn't have to make conventional sense. Sarah's year had to make conventional sense. It's set it's set in a real time and place, but this is set
Mm.
in a fictional, mythical time and place. So the story would go off in these weird and wacky, to my logical mind, directions, and I kept trying to say, no, no, you can't go there because it doesn't make any sense. And and I would have to pull myself back and surrender my control over the story. And every time I did that, it was perfect. And
That's
the
so
story would
cool.
go off in its weird tangent, but always come back to where it needed to be in a way that was way more imaginative and creative than anything I could have conjured up, or try to figure out or engineer.
So
So every
essentially,
book,
that is saying like our logical brain has no role in creative writing. Like it just needs to learn how to turn it off.
so well, obviously we need our those faculties to write and to spell, do all those things. But what we don't need is the censoring and the second guessing and the judging. And
So
because
our
I come
critical
from
brain.
Exactly. Because I come from a place in my own life of such judgment and such self criticism that I really get this.
Yeah.
Um, and I will tell you, I will confess, because no one else is listening, just you. I will confess that I still have judgment and
Yeah.
I still second guess. But what I've learned to do is ignore it.
Yeah. How did you develop that skill? So I know that you went through and you kind of had situations come up in your life that started to prove to you that you were creative, that you were, but there also is that belief. Like if we believe we're not creative, it doesn't matter if someone offers you $100,000 for your creativity, you're going to be like, now the imposter syndrome setting in, this doesn't feel right. What does this guy gain out of it? Cuz I know if your belief system tells you that you're not. But how did you transition into believing that you were a creative?
So I took that creative writing workshop. It was a 1 day workshop through the non-credit department at the University of Toronto. At the end of the day, the instructor, who would become my mentor, said, "If anybody wants to continue on an ongoing basis, we can have maybe monthly classes at my apartment." And God knows why I said yes, but I did. Um, Kind of like it's the whole main publicity thing. I mean, it's like the word comes out of my mouth before I have a chance to stop.
Who said that?
Yeah, exactly. And I said yes, and I began to work with Carol and this group, this other group, the group that had joined us from the workshop over the next months. And it was through those classes that I began to write poetry. I'd never written poetry. Now, I don't know that it was very good poetry, but I began to explore an aspect of my creativity that I'd always been too terrified to explore. Um, and I began to get support and validation. So I wasn't doing
Yeah.
this in a vacuum. Um, so I think that's part of what began it. Um, but I have to say that writing the Moon Quest was one of the. I was going to say it was maybe it probably was the hardest book I've ever written, because I didn't know what I was doing.
And that's your
Um,
fantasy
I
one, correct?
yeah, and that was my first book, and I was writing in a vacuum. That I was no longer working with that mentor anymore. This several years had passed, and I had to somehow trust, which is again one of the foundations of what I teach, is to trust the story, to trust the words. I had to somehow trust that what was coming out of me onto the page, as I surrendered to it, would be okay, or better than okay, hopefully. Well, that is the book of mine that's won the most awards.
Yeah.
Um,
I have a question for
and
you on that. As
yeah,
you, so you surrender to the plot and you surrender to these scenes and you feel so right. They feel so right. What happens when an editor gets involved and they say otherwise? Have you experienced that yet?
I have experienced that, but not with that book. I experienced that with actually my first book for writers, which is called The Voice of the Muse. There's Muse again, answering the call to write. And she came back with some feedback that I felt was totally off. not only totally off, kind of totally off the spiritual underpinning of the book,
Yeah.
and I ignored it.
Yeah. We can
In
do that.
the We can do that. In fact, one of my books for writers is actually a different approach to editing and revision. It's called The Heartful Art of Revision: An Intuitive Guide to Editing. And
Mm,
instead of being, a left-brain cut and slash uh, approach to editing, it's much more whole brain and much more intuitive. And I wrote that because nobody else was talking about editing that way.
yeah. Yeah, as soon as the editor says cut it, we cut it. As soon as they say, this isn't going to work, we're like, okay, yeah, I guess it's not going to work. We don't second guess it a lot of the times.
Well, and I think one of the things that I teach is the idea of creating a vision statement for your work. Um, um, and the idea behind, I mean, there's several ideas behind the vision statement, but one of the ideas behind the vision statement is that to make sure that everything that you're creating for your book, fiction or nonfiction or screenplay or whatever, kind of aligns with that vision. And so when you are editing, or when your editor comes back to you and says, "I don't like that," well, you can see you can kind of get a sense of whether the editor is right in terms of your vision, or whether the editor is wrong.
Right.
And I have a background in editing too, and I stopped editing professionally because I realized, and this was during that period of transition from the freelance writing to the creative writing, that being an editor was a professional perfectionist, and being a perfectionist was anti-creative.
Yeah.
And
Ah, man.
I could not continue to edit in the way I'd edited before. I mean, it shifted so I could write that book, but I couldn't edit because as a professional editor, I was a cut and slash editor, and I was saying, no, this has. I was doing all the things you're talking about,
You're the problem,
and
Mark David.
I was the problem, not the problem anymore, but I was the problem, and I realized I couldn't do that anymore. I could not be that kind of perfectionist, because perfection doesn't exist. All you're
Yeah.
doing is banging your head against trying to make something better and better and better and better and better. And it's never going to be perfect.
Yep.
Um, and I couldn't be a professional perfectionist and write,
Yeah.
so I let that go. And now the very rare times when I'll work with somebody on a manuscript, I consult on the manuscript. I will give them broad ideas of what is working, what is not working, um, and work with them to improve it. But the kind of perfectionism editing that I was doing before, I just won't do anymore.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, we're gonna be all over the place, and my
That
listeners already know because I have ADHD brain, and I'm like, okay, I need to know. Did you find your biological father? Did you end up meeting him? How did that happen?
oh, that's a okay. So yes and no. Um, the yes is I knew once I was told who he was. Well, first of all, everyone had already died by the time I was told the story,
Yeah, dang,
and
that is so rough. So you can't go to the source. You're just like, okay, I have to get the information myself through other people.
so but I knew who this man was.
Oh
So I had met him. Of course, I hadn't known he was my father. Um, I'm guessing he knew he was my father, but I'm also guessing that my mother probably would have threatened him with the worst kind of torturous death if he ever if he ever said
She
or
pulled out her
hinted at
mama bear
anything.
voice.
Yeah, hinted at anything that might suggest otherwise. Um, and first of all, you have to remember the times. I was born in 1954, so
Yeah,
we're talking different time um, for my mother,
yeah,
and so we're talking about the fear of judgment. Well, she would have been terrified of being judged. That's why the fear um, while she was pregnant, because
yeah,
if it came out that I wasn't my father's son, who was going to be blamed? It was going to be her, right?
yeah. Now, the dad
Um,
that you grew up thinking as your dad, did you guys have a really close relationship?
nope, not at all.
The plot
So
thickens.
so he would have known I wasn't his based on the research that I did after my mother's friend told me the story, but he might not have known how I wasn't his. on top of that, he was severely diabetic, and he died when a couple of months before I turned 14, and
Oh
during the
my
last
gosh.
few years, he'd been hospitalized full time. So, but even before that, I never felt any kind of close relationship with him. Um, now, according to my mother's friend, the reason she told me the story was not because I needed to know who my father was. I needed to know who my father wasn't, because
Mm,
there was a lot of childhood and sickness in that family. My father's Two of my father's siblings died in their teens, and he was severely diabetic. He wanted to know I did not have those genes, so I would not have to worry medically. Of
yeah.
course, that was for me. That was like this much of the story, and everything else was this much of the story.
Right. Yeah. You're like, "My identity is wrapped up in this." I wait, oh, yeah, also diabetes and stuff but wait,
Yeah,
let's go back to all the other stuff.
right, right. There are many times in my life when I discovered I wasn't who I thought I was, and that was a biggie. It
Right,
was definitely a
yeah.
biggie.
And so this was later on in life, you were an adult, your mom was your did you and your mom have a close relationship?
We had a very close relationship. She died in '84, and it was in '84 when I had that conversation with her friend.
Yeah. How old were you at the
Um,
time?
I was 30.
30. Wow, okay. Yeah, that is I'm picturing myself at 8 finding out, my parents aren't my parents biologically. I cannot imagine now, roughly, where I'm like, "Okay, now the people that I thought for 30 years are not my
Right.
parents." Like, that is a definite, identity shift.
Well, in terms of my relationship or non-relationship with my father, it things began to make sense.
Yeah,
I mean, until that point, I just put the whole thing off on his illness. But suddenly I thought, well, here I was, this flesh and blood kind of rebuke.
yeah,
Um, um, the story apparently, so after my mother's friend told me the story, and I began to do research. Okay, this is before the internet, so it was a little more challenging to do that kind of research. I spoke to another one of my mother's old friends, um, and she told me that the story that was put out at the time to close friends and family, including my father, I guess, was that it was artificial insemination. I thought, well, that can't be right. I mean, in 1954, but I did research it and discovered that, yes, it was experimental, but it was done in 1954.
mm,
So that's why I say that my Gerson father must have known I wasn't his, but did he know, was that the story he was told, or I don't know.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's that's a piece of the mystery, a piece of the story that will always be a mystery. But
Ah, that's
In Sarah's year, the young man, his name is Bernie. Um, his mother has my parents' relationship was stormy. In Sarah's year, it's a good relationship, but she falls in love with somebody else who she
yeah,
will never have. But there's a one night stand, and that's how Bernie is conceived. Um,
mm.
and he discovers years later
Do you feel like
that
writing and this is another really awesome thing about writing and how it's therapeutic. Do you feel like writing that closure of, like, what happened, how it happened, and why it happened helped you with some closure of, like, I'm never potentially gonna know the full story of how my situation happened?
Yeah, and again, it's for someone who if I had a really close relationship with my father, this would have been more shocking, I think.
Yeah,
But because he died early. I mean, he was
yeah,
56, I think, when he died. He died early. The relationship, I can't say it was rocky, it just wasn't there. So suddenly I had an explanation
yeah,
for something that had puzzled me. So in a sense, it was that kind of closure was helpful. Oh, now I get it.
yeah. Was so
Um,
was he the dad who raised you for the 14 years, was he super judgmental, or was he kinda just like,
I just
you
don't
could
remember
never
him really being present.
really?
So I
Did
don't
he
think he
work a
was.
lot?
Well, he was an architect, but diabetes kills your eyesight, and I
Mhm.
don't I don't remember him working. So I must have
Yeah.
been very young when he stopped.
Interesting.
He yeah. So I don't even know of anything that he actually designed.
Yeah.
which I would have loved to have known.
Right, yeah. Oh my goodness. It's crazy what our minds hold on to with that we don't realize. Like I'm trying to think of, and I'm sure you've thought of this too, like where the judgment, where the fear comes from, you go back to your in utero stuff, but there's gotta be some of the stuff from the original dad who raised you till you're 14-year-old that kind of stuck into your belief system too, I imagine as well.
Probably, and and as I did mention, my sister was a bit of a bully, and that probably didn't help either. Um, so we didn't have, as adults, we didn't have a bad relationship. We didn't have a particularly close relationship either.
Now,
Um,
her so she's half sister then, correct? How did she
well, in fact, not even because, like you, she was adopted.
Oh, wow, okay. So the dad who passed away, he doesn't have any biological children of his own.
The story gets way more complicated than we have time than
I
we have
I am
time for.
I'm invested in your story, Mark David. Oh my
So
gosh.
so I will send you to Act of Surrender, a writer's memoir, because then you can read the the whole thing. But otherwise,
All right,
we'll go
guys.
on.
Everyone who's listening is going to buy that book right now too because we need to know. There's so many. Okay, you're right though. Let's move on to something else. You mentioned that you staged a writer's strike against your muse. So we all at this point know that your muse is really just your internal dialogue telling
Of
you you're
course,
not good enough.
right, right. Well, so I had written the first three books of the fantasy series. Um, when I wrote the Moon Quest, I didn't think it was a series. I just thought it was one off, and suddenly there were three books. And then I thought it was a trilogy. Well, now it's not a trilogy because I'm working on the fifth book, but that's another story. I'd written the five. Sorry, the five. Stop that. I'd written the first three books, and I'd
Oh,
actually
there
written
it is.
screen
There's your small trajectory change.
right, and I'd written screenplay adaptations of the first three books. So I've done that, and I have some interest, although it's kind of dormant right now. And one morning I woke up and I said, what'd be cool? Because I'm a big theater buff. Would it be cool to write like a stage musical adaptation of these three stories? I mean, you want to know how insane I am? That's how insane I am. So I began to work on stage musical adaptations of the three stories, which meant I had to revisit those stories in depth. Now, those they're not light fantasy. There's a lot of darkness in those stories, and it's all pulled from my gut, right? I mean, this is I write from deep places within. So revisiting those three stories was so intense for me that one day I woke up and I said, you know what? I won't use the language I used that morning, but you can imagine what I said. This is not working for me. The books are not selling very well. Um, this is just way too hard. Not creatively, it's way too emotionally hard.
Yeah.
And until something shifts, I'm done. And so for the next 2 weeks, except for one thing, I spent the next 2 weeks reading murder mysteries and watching Netflix. But
You
I
Netflixed
had
and
a
chilled.
right. I had an internet radio. I had a blog talk radio show back then where I gave writing tips and also interviewed authors, kind of like you. This is before this cool technology, and I had interviewed a J.A. Jantz, who's a New York Times bestselling mystery author. Um, but we'd done it over the phone, and I had committed to editing the interview. She was so wonderful to give me her time. I said, the last thing I'm going to do as a writer is edit and post this interview. So I'm sitting there because it was audio. I'm sitting and listening to the interview. And one of the things that she had said was, like me, she doesn't outline. And I thought, as a mystery author, don't you have to figure all this stuff out to plant
Right.
everything?
Yeah.
I said, if anyone's going to outline, it's someone who writes mystery. She said, oh no, she said. She said, I, I just love it. I start with a dead body, and then I trust. It's kind of an act of faith. She said, I trust that the story it'll all reveal itself.
She's
And as
playing
soon
Clue
as
in her mind as she's
yes,
writing
right,
these stories.
exactly. But as soon as she used the word faith, I thought, shit. That's the end of my strike.
Yeah.
That is how I write. That is how I live. Spiritual, not religious faith. And
Yeah.
that was the end of it. The strike ended. There were no concessions from the employer. I just went back to work.
That is beautiful. That is, you're right. I feel like of all people, those people need an outline. But to just play Clue in your mind and have fun of like, this is a game and I'm here too, she's probably as surprised as the murderer as we are.
Right, right. Well, and she writes great mysteries. I mean, she has several mystery series, and yeah, so you can't tell if she's winging it. And I'm sure, there's stuff she has to go back and tidy up and maybe insert clues later on. But in that first draft, she just starts with a dead body and that's that.
So
Um,
do you feel like that was your point where you're like, okay, you were on strike, you're like, I'm done. We're not being creatives anymore. Everyone's going to get on board with this. And then your creative mindset was like, knock, knock, knock. Actually, you need to pay attention to what she just said. Do you think that that fueled your desire to then help other people
I
break
was
through their
I was
blocks?
I had already written. Had I already written? I'd already written my first book for writers by that point, and I had already done some teaching at that point. I wasn't doing any teaching then, but I had done some. Um, no, I think it was more kind of the two by four over the head, reminding me who I was and why I was a writer, really, more than anything else. Um, and as someone who teaches, coaches, writers, who's written about writing the creative process, I think sometimes I have to have certain experiences that may not be the most fun for me, so I can identify with the people who come to me as students
Yeah.
or coaching clients. Because I've done the judgment stuff, I've done the fear stuff, I've done the writer's block stuff. I know I've lived all that stuff.
Yeah.
So I think as little fun as it was to live it, um, and it was no fun at all to live it, it's made me a better teacher. It's made me a better coach. It's made me. It's turned me to someone who really not only has empathy but has solutions for
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. I imagine you can you can kind of see someone and see where they're stuck, especially if they're stuck in a similar spot where you were, that you see it before they do.
Well, one of my books for writers. This is we've already talked about two of them. The third book I'm going to mention is a book on writer's block. It's called Writer's Block Unblocked. So if I can get this the long subtitle: Seven Surefire Ways to Free Up Your Writing and Creative Flow. So again, I that in fact I think was the second book for writers I wrote. And again,
Yeah.
I touched on writer's block in The Voice of the Muse, but I figured I had a whole lot more to say.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny, they mention, I've heard the analogy of like, you have someone who goes to school for being a mechanic, and then you have the kid who grew up watching dad work on his cars, grandpa work on his cars, and like they're in, the garage and he can hear the sound of the car and be able to diagnose it, whereas the guy who went to school has to get out all the technology, run all the
Right,
tests. That is exactly what you're, the kid who had watched the grandpa or
right,
dad work on the cars.
right. Yeah. No. Again, I everything I do, I work from a very intuitive place. In fact, when I first started teaching writing, I wasn't sure what to do because I have no method.
Yeah.
I don't have a program. What I'm training people to do is to trust their story, to trust their intuition, to trust their inner wisdom, however you want to frame that. And whether it's in my books for writers or my other self-help books, um, I'm saying the same thing. In fact, you'd have to say those messages come across in my fiction as well.
Yeah. So, what do you find most rewarding about helping people resurface and rekindle their creativity?
Just that. I mean, someone who thinks they're not a writer, or has no ideas or too many ideas, or is so stuck somewhere in the middle. I mean, anytime I can get someone moving again, that is hugely satisfying.
Yeah. And you
Because
mentioned that you can't not write. What is it? How do you keep, so you've, is it just because you've mastered the writer's block, so it's like you are able to just sit down and write, or is there something that keeps drawing you, like you're passionate about storytelling after so many years?
In fact, I guess if I had to say, what are you really, I'd probably have to say I'm a storyteller.
Yeah.
I mean, how many stories have I told you today?
Yeah, I love it.
So,
I've
and
already got a list of all your books because you're really good at telling me just enough, but not everything I want to know. So I see where your marketing comes into play very well.
but that's intuitive too. But so the fantasy series, the Quintana Legend of Quintana, is all about storytellers. And
Oh
the first
wow.
book in that, the Moon Quest, the first book in that series takes place in a mythical time and place, so that's feeling a whole lot less mythical these days, where stories have been banned, storytellers have been exiled or put to death. And the legend has it that the moon was so saddened by the silence in the land that she cried tears and extinguished her light. So the moon has not been seen. And so the point of that, or the point of the moon quest, of the quest in that story, is to bring story back to the land and light back to the moon. But it takes place under a very tyrannical regime, obviously.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh my gosh.
and
Okay, add that to my TBR. Great. This is that's literally all this session is just you filling up my TBR even more than it already is.
happy to oblige. Um, and I began writing that story in 1994, so it's not like
Wow.
I was trying to write some kind of political
Yeah.
manifesto. And
That's a testament to say about storytelling and how storytelling connects with humanity through the years.
well, the funny thing about the Moon Quest, so it came out. In fact, I not only wrote it, began at 94. I began in a different country. I began writing it in Canada, and I wrote most of the first two drafts hiding away in rural Nova Scotia. So it's not like I was in the world even really. Um, but the book came out in 2007, and since 2007, so that's 17 years ago, almost 18 years ago, people have said to me in every year it's been read, "Wow, this you must have been writing about now."
Yeah.
And of course, we're saying that now too, of course.
Yeah.
And
Especially now. And that's probably
especially
what they
now.
said then.
But that's it. That is what they said then. And so, what astounds me, um, and astounds me over and over again through my time as a writer, is what I said before, just how much smarter my stories are than I am. I could never have come up. I could never plan to write something like this.
Right.
I didn't even know what the hell the story was about. Was while I was writing it. It wasn't until it was
Yeah.
done that I knew what the story
Yeah.
was about, and really what it was about for me, because I hadn't creatively blocked for so many years. Was it was a metaphor for my own creative rekindling.
Yeah.
The storytellers being silenced was me.
Yeah, because you already pictured all of them being murdered. You're like,
Right.
I
That's
got this
right.
story.
No machine guns in that world, but you get the idea. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, and all the books have storytellers as their main characters. So the whole idea of storytelling is central. Well, and go back to the Sarah stories. Well, Sarah wants to be a writer.
Yeah.
The whole concept of storytelling is like in everything that I teach, everything that I speak about, everything that I write. So yes,
Yeah.
I'm a writer, but really I'm a storyteller.
I had someone on the podcast, and she said that Emily Burrell, she is a literary agent, and she said that storytelling is her religion. And I was like, and she's like, even in religions, how they pass down through stories through the younger generations, like that is the people, the historians, that's stories that they have collected over time. Storytelling is her religion. And I was like, I'm stealing that because that is brilliant and beautiful and I love it.
Well, storytelling is innate, and what I like to say is that even before we had spoken language, never, let alone written language, so you can imagine the hunter gatherers coming back from a day's hunting and kind of miming out their day. They're telling a
Yeah.
story. They didn't have the
Yeah.
language, but they had the stories. We've been telling stories as long as there has been an us.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep, as soon as one
and
person found another person, that's where the
Right.
stories happened.
That's right. And all day long we're telling stories. We're not aware that we're telling stories, but all day long we're telling stories.
Oh right,
And
yeah, our belief systems are our internal stories. You told
And
yourself that you're not a creative. That was your story.
exactly, and it wasn't true. I
Yep.
disproved that, or it disproved me, I guess,
Yeah,
is a
yeah.
better way of putting it. But I mentioned the Mark David Gerson School of Writing at the outset. Well, the tagline, at least for now, is "It has never been more important to tell our stories," and I
Yeah.
really, really believe that. But again, it speaks to everything that I've written. Um, in the Moon Quest, the main character in the Moon Quest is a young man who's pushed out. The reluctant hero is pushed out on a quest, on this quest I told you about, and he's not told where to go. He's not told what to do. He's told to let the stories that, not the story he's been taught, but the stories that come to him spontaneously, to let those stories guide the journey. And so the story, the Moon Quest, is filled with his stories, and it's those stories that come to him spontaneously. Because, of course, he's a young bard, he's been taught stories, but he's told, no, those aren't the stories you need to worry about. You need to come up with your own stories, and those are the stories that will guide your way. Um,
Oh, that's so cool. I even like
and
that you put Bard in there because that immediately fantasy. I've got this guy pictured.
Rich.
Like, very, very good job.
So I've got bard, but the chief bard is the elder bard.
Oh my gosh. I've never heard of an elder bard before, and now I
Uh,
need to know everything about that guy.
so
Oh,
and in Cantana, in that land, the elder bardship is passed from mother to daughter and father and daughter to son. So mother to father to daughter, mother to son. So it always rotates gender. Um,
oh my gosh, that is so cool. Okay, yep. So literally, guys, I know everyone here is just gonna go to Mark David Gerson's website and add all of his books to our TBRs because you have done such a fantastic job of just giving us just the right amount and the way that you are connected to these stories. We talk about it all the time, putting ourselves in the stories and like reading a piece of you through these stories. It's part of who you are, part of your personality. You're so personable. You're so connected with you're getting throughout the years more connected with yourself, and that is so beautiful, and people find themselves authentically.
well, thank you. So the other thing about the Moon Quest, I wrote the first draft of the Moon Quest in the third person.
Oh,
Um, he said, she said, and as I'm finishing the first draft and suddenly I have a story. I know what the story is. I have a title, the whole thing. That little pesky voice of a Muse says the story really needs to be told in the first person. But I realized then that the story I've been writing was my story. Speaking to what you just said, was a story of
hmm,
my creative reawakening. And if I had known I was writing about me, I don't think I could ever have written that book.
right.
So writing that first draft in the third person was kind of a shield.
Yeah.
It allowed me to tell the story. And every
Well,
other book in that series, not always from the different characters, is always told in the first person.
yeah, and how much deeper you were able to get into their emotions and what they were feeling and thinking, and even the things that they missed, right? Because that's a huge part of first person is it creates this ability to miss things that revealed later because the character you're looking at what the character's looking at.
Right. Well, the cool thing about fantasy is you can find ways of revealing things in a fantasy world that you can't necessarily in the conventional world.
Right, yeah, yeah. This mage comes up and gives you this vision of things. We don't get that.
Right. Right. So I have there were some mechanisms in there to allow that to happen. And
Yeah.
in the fourth book and the fifth book, which I'm working on right now, those are told from multiple first person points of view, which of course is making me totally crazy.
But that's coming so popular now is like they people enjoy the multiple person or the multiple personalities. I think that's
Personality.
what we feel like.
That's
That's
me,
what we
multiple
feel like.
personality.
The different perspectives because that really wasn't super popular like before with fantasy or other things is shifting into all the different perspectives, and now it's like we're following seven different storylines potentially in one book and we get a little piece of all these different characters in this one giant story.
Well, when I wrote The Bard of Bryndoon, which was the fourth book and the first one that has multiple first person points of view, I had never read a book that had multiple first person points of
Yeah.
view. And I'm thinking, this is bullshit.
No one's gonna read this. No one's gonna
No
be
one's
able to
gonna.
follow this.
All the characters are going to sound the same. It's going to be so confusing. So again, the judgment, right? I was
Yeah.
listening to the story the way it wanted to be told, and I was second guessing every inch of the way, because I just thought this is the worst piece of crap I've ever written. And book comes out, one of the first reviews, best book Mark David Gerson has ever written.
You're like, wait,
My
what?
my stories are smarter than I am.
Oh,
I
I
keep
love
coming back,
your
to that.
intuition.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And
That
so
is so
the
fun.
fifth book, what I'm working on right now, which is called The Lost Horse of Bryn Dune, has even more characters speaking in the first person. And it's like watching. When I was a kid and we go to the Three Ring Circus, I hated it because I didn't know where to look. Right, Three Ring Circus. Well, now it's like watching a multi-dimensional 50 ring circus because I don't even know where the story's going from from one chapter to the next.
I love that. And it's like, so there's stories going on all over the place. It just depends on where you're looking. And that's life
Exactly.
too, right? Like, where are
Right.
you going to put the focus for right now? But the story is happening collectively. Like,
Right.
everyone's going through it. It's just who are you focusing on to push the narrative?
Exactly. Exactly. So I'm sure it'll be fine. Right now, it's making me crazy.
Oh my gosh. And that's a testament to you have overcome self-doubt quite a bit. You have worked through it, but still after all this time, you've got successful books out and you're still like, I don't know, people might not
Well,
I don't know.
each book pushes me. I'm not writing
Yeah.
the same book over and over again, which would be a whole lot easier, but then what would be the point? So each
Yeah.
book pushes me harder emotionally. Each book pushes me harder creatively. And these two most recent books in the fantasy series have really pushed me hard creatively. The Sarah books, because there was autobiographical stuff, and then really pushed me hard emotionally.
So you just said something that's probably going to blow a lot of authors' minds who are listening to this. Writing doesn't get easier. Is that what you're telling me? This doesn't get
Uh,
easier. We just level up.
yeah, and that's what I'm telling you.
Oh my gosh.
So each book may be as hard as the one before, but it's a way better book. It's a way more accomplished book. It's a book that takes the author and the readers deeper. So yeah, I mean, um, when I finished the Sun Quest, which I thought was the end of the series, there's a whole story about how the series continued. I thought, great, that's the end of that. But the Bard of Bryn Dune really pushed me so hard.
Yeah.
And even though it was said best book I've ever written, now I'm working on the next book in the series, which is pushing me even harder.
Yeah. Oh
And
my goodness.
I feel like I said this to a friend the other day. I feel like I'm looking at the backside of a tapestry with all you see are the loose threads, and I have
Yeah.
no
It's like this
idea
looks like a
how
mess.
how these threads come together.
Yeah. Gotta walk around to the other side. Come where we're looking at it. We're at different perspectives.
That's right, but I don't see the other side until I'm done. Right, at least until I've
Yep,
done the first
yep.
draft. So
Oh my gosh. So that's the book that would do you have like an expected date when that's done, or is that just the book that you are working on right now and it'll come out when it comes out?
I would I would like to say a lot of things I would like to say. One of the things I would like to say is that it'll be out.
Intuitively.
It'll be. I'd like to say that on my website it says it'll be out this year. Um, so that does buy me another 11 months. So
Right.
and unlike the Moon Quest, which was a total chaotic mess that first draft, um, as one thing I can say, as with each book, the writing is more accomplished, so fewer drafts are required.
Yeah, yeah.
So if I can get through this, if I can finally figure out the story and get through this draft, then the next drafts won't be. It'll be reasonably clean. The next drafts won't require as much work. At least that's been my how it's worked so far.
Yeah, yeah. So the the final process takes less time, but the amount of work and like the emotional work that we put into it does not get easier. So the process gets
Yeah,
easier.
right.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. We're
So
figuring this thing out.
I write better. Um, I write cleaner. Um, but it's hard. But what I have to write pushes me harder.
Yeah, I love that. So if you could give a piece of advice to someone who doubts their abilities to tell their story, what would that be?
Okay, so I'm going to reframe it a little bit because if you doubt your ability to tell your story, you're not trusting your story and you're trying to be in control. So what I would say is get out of your way, get out of your story's way. If you're writing fiction, get out of your character's way and let them tell their story to you.
Yeah.
Listen, abandon control, trust, surrender, and just write, right?
Right? That sounds right to me. Oh my goodness. I didn't know. I just looked down at the time and I was like, there's no way that we've been talking for over an hour. I still have so many questions to ask you. This is insane. Oh, I love this. All right, I have one final question for you
Sure,
before we kind of direct people on where to find all your stuff. If
sure.
you had to boil down your philosophy, all of what you do, what would that be? Like, what is your core thing that describes you?
I would say I'm a storyteller who gets out of the way and lets and frees the stories to happen.
Yeah, I love it. Oh my gosh,
Sometimes,
that's so good.
sometimes grudgingly, I have to say, I have to confess,
You're
but
mumbling and grumbling the whole time.
right, yeah, but I do it, and the results usually prove that the system works, basically.
Yeah, you're right. It just reiterates the confidence in yourself of just letting go,
Right.
let those pieces fall where they must,
So
and
with so
then
with
the
so I'm just saying with this book, yes, I have lots of doubts, but I also know that it's worked before.
yeah,
And for all the doubts I had in its predecessor, it worked really well. So I know
yeah,
it will work. Now the difference is I know it'll work,
yeah.
even though I'm bitching and complaining and moaning and doing all the usual writer stuff. Um, I know in the end it'll be fine,
I love that.
which I
You
did
just
not
we get
know
to
for the Moon Quest.
right. Okay, okay. You're opening up some doors here. I like where this is going. Where can we, because me, I'm asking for me. I don't care about what anyone else wants. I need to know I need to know
Sure,
where to find your books and where they can connect with you for your coaching and workshops and things like that.
sure. So the kind of grand central station for me is my website, which is markdavidgerson.com. You'll find all my books there. The Mark David Gerson School of Writing is there as well, and you'll find the books for writers there, the writing courses there. If I'm offering any live events, they'll be there. Um, my books are also available in paperback and ebook from all the usual places online. I've also we didn't get a chance to talk about this. I've also recorded the Moon Quest as an audiobook.
Oh, you
Um,
recorded it yourself?
I recorded it myself. That's a whole other show.
I
Um,
know. Crap.
but that's available on Audible and Apple Books right now. I'm hoping that'll expand soon. But right now, it's on Apple and Audiobooks, and I'm on Facebook. My username most places is Mark David Gerson, all one word, or markdavidgerson.author in some places. But you'll find me on Facebook, on Instagram. You'll find me on Blue Sky and Threads now, um, and all on YouTube, all over the place. But you'll find a lot of those links also on my website. And there's also a
Awesome.
contact page on my website. So if you want to reach out and talk to me, you can also do that there.
Perfect. Oh my gosh. Mark David, it has been so fantastic having you on. This has been such a fun conversation for me because I love whenever I get to the end of these interviews and I still have questions that I don't get to know the answers to. So that's always fun suspense for me. It lets me know that this is a good conversation.
Great. Well, it's a delight to chat with you. I'm happy to chat with you anytime. It's been lots of fun.
Awesome. Alrighty, guys. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of L3. I cannot wait to see you on the next one and our pending having Mark David back on. Hey guys, thanks for joining us on this episode of Lemon's Listening Library. Remember, every story has a journey, and every journey deserves to be heard. Keep reading, keep writing, and keep listening.